This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. This is the defensive fighting at Dinneberg in 1944, modern-day Daugavpils in Latvia. Let's begin. When we got back to division headquarters, I was introduced to the new division commander. It was an oberst who up to then had been the commandant of one city or another in East Prussia or in Lithuania. He then thought he had discovered the strategist in himself. He was a man who never allowed a word in edgewise from his operations officer who had been in a combat division on the Eastern Front from the beginning. I've always regretted having to work with two divisional commanders of this caliber, especially in the last weeks and days before my forced departure home. This was especially true after having experienced only terrific men up to then. I still think back to the men in those positions with eternal gratitude and the greatest respect. They were tactically proficient and good human beings. Initially, of course, the oberst was very nice and asked me to turn in the awards recommendations. He had cigarettes brought to my men. When we started to talk about the evaluation of the captured maps and the statements of the prisoners, however, our opinions were already clashing. After a short time, Major Schwanner and I accepted our place, said a short jawohl, and left. It should be noted that the oberst was of the opinion that the Russians had only made the markings on the map to lead us astray. In his, the colonel's opinion, the Russian main thrust would undoubtedly be made east of the Dinneberg-Rositten-Rollbahn, heading south in the direction of Dinneberg. An envelopment around Dinneberg was entirely out of the question. Unfortunately, a few days later, I would find out with my own body how correct we had been in our opinion. I had procured a few additional men from a road construction unit for night security. I was able to bring them along in a truck. Such protection, of course, was mostly for psychological support. It would be enough, however, if these men paid attention and kept their ears open. That was already help enough for us because I wanted my crews to rest up somewhat whenever possible. At the forward supply point, I met Lieutenant Eichhorn. His tank had just come out of the workshop. Along with him in the truck, I drove forward to the company. We arrived there shortly before midnight. Lieutenant Nienstedt made his report. Up to then, everything had been quiet, and nothing had been seen or heard of the enemy. Nienstedt had set up our tanks to pull security at the edge of the village. They were facing the creek and following my suggestion in such a manner that the vehicles were backed up to the creek. The cannons were turned to the rear so that we could quickly back up by driving forward if necessary. This method had always proven itself whenever we were all by ourselves in no man's land. At nighttime, we tankers were somewhat helpless because we were not able to fire an aimed shot with our weapons. Because of that, every infantryman was in an unquestionably superior position to us if he had guts and did his work in a halfway clever manner. We went into an abandoned Russian house. The peasants had already left the village in the evening, not perceiving anything good. There, using the map, I discussed with both of my platoon leaders what was supposed to happen during the night on the part of the infantry. The infantry had the mission of digging in about 3 kilometers west of us by the early morning hours. It also had to establish contact with our northern neighbors and then pass us through the new front lines. We therefore had to hold out the few hours until then in no man's land. We sat for about an hour in the abandoned farmhouse. We were talking good-naturedly when a guard suddenly came in. He was excited and reported he had distinctly heard Russians calling out to one another in the part of the village on the far side of the creek. That didn't seem possible to us. We still went to our tanks, however, and lo and behold, the young soldier had heard right. We now had to keep absolutely quiet so as not to draw the Russians' attention to us. All the tank commanders were then informed. That wasn't so easy because our crews were so sound asleep after the many long nights that it was only possible to wake them by shaking them vigorously. Yelling was impossible and whispering made little sense with frontline soldiers. I will not repeat what slipped out of the men's mouths in their half-sleep when we tore them from their dreams. I breathed a lot easier when I finally had all of them halfway together. It would have been so easy for Ivan to capture us if he had thought we were still there and had kept quiet. The enemy on the far side of the creek became increasingly lively. We soon heard a tank moving on the other side. It was guided with a lot of yelling and flashlights. It was now time to withdraw behind the village in order to have open fields of fire and be able to survey the situation. After all, it wouldn't take much longer before the first Russians crossed the little bridge toward us. We let loose with a suitable barrage of fire from all vehicles simultaneously. I would have been only too glad to have seen what a dumb look Ivan had on his face. We then drove out of the village. After about 600 to 800 meters, we set up a new position to wait there until morning so that the infantry behind us could dig in undisturbed. Using tracers, we shot a few houses in the village into flames. That way, we wouldn't be surprised and could also see something. Except for a few mortar barrages, we generally had quiet. Only a single Russian tank fired wildly in our direction, without precision and much too wide. It was apparently the tank that they had guided in earlier. Lieutenant Eichhorn aimed at the muzzle fire, and after the third shot, the Russians literally flew in the air. Pure luck. When the morning dawned, we heard heavy armor noises to the east and northeast, but no Russians let themselves be seen. At daybreak, we drove back the same way we had come and found our new front lines already occupied. I established contact with the commander of the infantry battalion. I had 2 vehicles remain with him, and 2 other vehicles were placed with the neighboring battalion. I took the remaining vehicles with me to the Rolban. We set up to screen in Malinava, where the Russians had been 20 hours before with their screen. The day was completely quiet, but we knew that Ivan was getting ready again, and it was the calm before the storm. The continuous sound of heavy armor was to be heard in the wooded terrain that began 1 to 2 kilometers northeast of us. We waited for the Russians to start the attack. We were mistaken, however. We were not subjected to any more attacks there. We only saw occasional figures who took a look at us using binoculars from the edge of the woods. Whenever they became too bold, we sent a few steel greetings on over to them, and the rascals then disappeared into the woods. The wildest rumors were spread the following night. Russian cavalry had broken through, and enemy tanks were attacking, among other things. But the Russians weren't even considering running up against our defensive front. Unfortunately, we made it much easier for them later when the front at Dinneberg was shifted and the Rolban evacuated. The situation was as follows. The division had set up all armor-defeating weapons, assault guns, Tigers, anti-tank guns, and anti-aircraft guns, along the road that went from my supply point toward Polotsk. These were to turn back the anticipated Russian attack to the south. Someone was located every 50 to 80 meters and waited for Russian tanks, but Ivan didn't come. The next day also went by quietly. The Russians brought more and more tanks into their assembly areas, however. A Stalin played a dirty trick on me when it shot off my right drive sprocket. I didn't find that out until I wanted to back up after the unexpected concussion and explosion. Feldwebel Kircher identified the guy right away. He also hit him in the front, but our 88mm cannon couldn't penetrate the heavy armor of a Stalin from that angle at that distance. Despite that, the Russians still preferred to withdraw. July 23rd didn't bring the expected attack either. Unusual quiet reigned on both sides. The only surprise attack against us came from 2 propaganda men who came racing up in a divisional kubel. They inquired their way through to my tank and asked about my particulars. They wanted to gain insight into the situation. As the first mortar barrage arrived, however, they had heard enough. They disappeared as fast as they had arrived. I could barely recognize the situation anymore in the report about our operation that circulated through the press. There was so much shooting going on, and we tankers were so brave. If my name hadn't been mentioned in the report, I really wouldn't have recognized our operation. Unfortunately, this type of reporting is still par for the course even today. Apparently, a reporter is seldom found who understands how to portray a situation factually and soberly, and in a manner that corresponds to reality. A report reached me the following night that our immediate high command had decided to pull back our main line to a position north of the Dinneberg-Polotsk Rolban by dawn. The line that we had previously held with great effort and difficulty was shifted. It had run from north to south. It was subsequently intended to run from east to west. As I discovered the next day, the line ended at the last houses northwest of Dinneberg, An 88mm anti-tank gun was posted there which had no contact to the east or west. The latter instance could not have pleased the crew because absolutely no one else was to the left of them. I immediately drove to the division command post after receiving the report. It was at the fork in the road north of Dineburg, at which met the Rollbahn to Polosk and the one to Rossitten. It was thus at the point where we had departed east a few days before. I also met my commander at the command post. We briefly discussed the new decision of the division commander and then immediately called on him. We wanted to be sure that at least the bridges over the culverts under the road wouldn't be demolished. It should be noted that all of them had already been prepared for demolition. During my nighttime trip, I had seen that an engineer was next to every bridge. He was just waiting there until he could blow the thing sky high. That would mean, however, that my tigers couldn't return. After this conversation, there was nothing left for me to do but drive immediately to our forward supply point in my Kubel. There, I picked out a number of my men and posted one at every demo site. He had to delay the premature demolition of the bridges by our engineer friends. I was completely against the demolition of the bridges if we had to shift the front lines back, because we weren't able to control the Rollbahn anymore. Ivan could move west over the road without danger to his flanks, something that we had always been able to prevent until then. Despite support from the operations officer, our arguments to the divisional commander were not successful. The high-ranking Herr desired that we, together with countless other weapons, should await the Russian attack that he anticipated would come from the north, east of the Dineburg-Rossitten Rollbahn. One didn't need to be a fortune-teller to see that this attack would never come. It was as clear as daylight to me, and to every soldier who used some reason, that Ivan would cross the road as soon as we had pulled our tanks back. He would do this without being noticed by us, let alone being hindered. He would then detour around the city of Dineburg from the north and take it from the northwest. There wasn't a single German soldier there, much less armor-defeating weapons. The Russians could thus advance into the city without any enemy contact and take the bridges. They would then have us in a pocket one more time. I got my tanks back into the new line just in the nick of time at dawn before the demolitions began. The explosions clearly showed the Russians, in case they hadn't noticed it already, that we weren't there anymore. They could move out at their leisure. Meanwhile, I still didn't want to come to terms with this type of suicide. In the early morning of July 24th, I once again spoke to the division. I requested they allow me to pull my company back in order to block the Dineburg-Riga Rollbahn. Even this request was not granted. At that point, I lost my patience. I asked Major Schwanner to release at least 4 of my tanks and order them to that position. As logic dictated, he agreed and had me move with these 4 tanks. After all, there wasn't anything to be gained there at the division. I also knew, however, that my tigers would be sorely missed elsewhere. I pulled Feldwebel Kirscher, Oberfeldwebel Göring, and Lieutenant Eichhorn out of the line. I had them wait at the cemetery at the Rollbahn, where we had refueled a few days before. The headquarters company was still at the same spot and could resupply us right away. I intended to hold up the Russian tanks for at least 24 hours on the Rollbahn to Riga, which was completely unguarded. Then, when the pressure became too strong, I would pull back to the city and build bridgeheads. We would thus cover the rearward passage of lines by the troops, ensuring that unnecessary casualties didn't arise. As our last action, we would have then driven over the railroad bridge and conducted a passage of lines through the newly established front line west of the Duna. Unfortunately, I was not able to execute this plan to its end. Fate had something else in mind for me. Many will ask themselves with astonishment why we continued to fight on so doggedly after everything already appeared to have been lost. One doesn't have to search very far to find a reason for our behavior. Everyone in the East, from the high command down to the lowliest platoon leader, was convinced that the enemy had to be kept from the German border for as long as possible to save as many women and children from the Russians as possible. Besides that, it was not permissible to allow the retreat to degenerate into headlong flight in order to prevent even more comrades from being encircled and falling into captivity. If events had taken the course the way that those who nowadays curse at the evil warmongers had wanted, then many of our women and children, and also many a true comrade, would not be alive now. I believe that every German, if not the entire free world, has come to the conclusion it would have been better for everyone if the Russians had not occupied half of Germany. After all, we didn't fight for a man or a system. On the contrary, we gave our best and our all for Germany, and, in the process, for ourselves. One has to consider our decision to do something on our own initiative from this perspective. We simply didn't want to remain sitting in a trap. The army had to get back over the Duna, and because of that, the crossing points had to be kept open. This concludes the 22nd part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.